Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. My name's Isabel Reynolds. I'm a long-term member of the club, and I'll be the moderator for today. I'm very happy to welcome someone who I think can enlighten us a bit about the diplomatic issue that's obsessing everybody around the world at the moment. What will happen if we see another term for President Trump? Mr. Alexander Gray, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Ms. Reynolds, for moderating, and to the club for hosting me. It's always a privilege to be here in Japan. I think I should probably start off first by qualifying that I'm here purely in my individual capacity as a private citizen. I don't speak for any campaign, candidate, political party, organization, government, purely here as a private citizen. And I'm here primarily to speak to the Tokyo Global Dialogue tomorrow, and to really share my perspective as someone who was fortunate enough to serve in the U.S. government in a number of capacities, at the National Security Council, at the White House, as the Chief of Staff, Deputy Assistant to President Trump, and Chief of Staff of the National Security Council, as the first person ever to serve as Director for Oceania and Indo-Pacific Security at the National Security Council, and prior to that as Special Assistant to the President for the Defense Industrial Base at the National Economic Council. And in those various roles, I gained an extraordinary appreciation for the U.S.-Japan alliance and the role that Japan plays in securing a free, open, and prosperous Indo-Pacific. It was my privilege during my tenure in government to get to witness what I would argue was the strongest, most cohesive, and successful the U.S.-Japan alliance has ever been. I think that when President Trump came into office, there was a tremendous amount of speculation, and I would even say consternation in some circles as to what President Trump would mean for the U.S.-Japan alliance. And when we fast forward to the end of his tenure, when he left office January 20th, 2021, I was one of the last two people to leave the West Wing of the White House on his last day in office. And we look back at what those 4 years meant for the alliance. It meant an unprecedented level of cooperation, an unprecedented level of coordination on an unprecedented level of issues and topics. U.S.-Japan cooperation expanded in the military realm, in the diplomatic realm, in the economic security realm. The U.S. was able, working with Japan, to craft a series of multilateral frameworks that were unprecedented in their scope, their scale, from the Quad to the variety of Indo-Pacific dialogues, economic security dialogues. The cooperation between the two countries expanded not just bilaterally, but across the board in international institutions. Really, under President Trump's leadership, the U.S.-Japan alliance reached what I would argue is the apex of its success since the end of World War II. And my hope is, should President Trump return to office, that I have every reason to believe that the same fundamental principles that guided his leadership from 2017 to 2021 will guide his leadership again if he returns to the Oval Office. President Trump outlined a number of principles for how he views the Indo-Pacific, and as a corollary to that, the U.S.-Japan alliance. If you look at what was declassified in January of 2021, the Indo-Pacific Strategic Framework, this document, which was declassified by my former boss, U.S. National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien, laid out President Trump's main areas of focus in the Indo-Pacific in a number of pillars. What I'd like to talk about today is one particular pillar of that strategic framework. That framework lays out the president's commitment to defending the first island chain, very explicitly mentions the U.S. commitment to keeping the first island chain free and open in the face of the Chinese Communist Party's malign activity. What I'd like to highlight today before I take your questions is my very real concerns that since President Trump left office, the U.S. mental map of the Indo-Pacific is going to have to expand beyond the first island chain. When you look at the Chinese Communist Party's aggression and malign activity, I'm now very deeply concerned that the second island chain, perhaps even into the third island chain, is now an area of substantial competition with the Chinese Communist Party. When I was privileged to serve as director for the Pacific Islands and Indo-Pacific security, it was my very great honor to work closely with Japan to build a coalition of like-minded countries who are dedicated to keeping the Chinese Communist Party out of the second island chain and to keep U.S. and Japanese interests well represented in that region. Today, in the 3 years since I left government service, we have seen China growing rapidly its ambitions and its presence in the Pacific Islands and in the second and third island chain. We know well from history how dangerous it can be to the peace, stability, and prosperity of the Indo-Pacific to have that island, the second and third island chain fall outside of the free and open framework. What we have seen in the last several years is China's ambitions to gain permanent military access in the second and third island chain expanding at an alarming rate. We've seen Taiwan's recognition in the diplomatic recognition across the Indo-Pacific, which when I came into the White House stood at 6 countries. Today, only 2 countries recognize Taiwan diplomatically. The CCP has waged a careful, concerted campaign through influence operations, through covert and overt means, to undermine the sovereignty of the countries of the Pacific Islands, Oceania, the second and third island chains, have sought to negatively impact their ability to choose their own partners. And what we have seen from the Solomon Islands to Kiribati to Tuvalu to Nauru, we have seen consistent Chinese Communist Party efforts to undermine their ability to make sovereign decisions about their choice of partners. We have seen China undermine governance. We have seen China, whether it's Vanuatu, Tonga, Solomon Islands, we have seen a consistent effort to undermine what I think the free and open Indo-Pacific concept would consider good governance structures and processes. We have seen a consistent effort by China economically through the Belt and Road Initiative to undermine the stability and the long-term sustainability of the countries of Oceania and the second and third island chains. Unfortunately, while China has been increasing its desire for coercive influence and potentially military access, at the same time, we have seen the United States withdraw from its active leadership role in the second island chain. The Compacts of Free Association with Palau, the Marshall Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia, one of the most critical pieces of a free and open Indo-Pacific, is currently languishing in the U.S. Congress, awaiting renewal. For those of you who are not familiar with the importance of the Compacts of Free Association, I can tell you that there is no more important U.S. strategic relationship in the second island chain than the special relationship we have with Palau, Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands. The Compacts of Free Association grant to the United States the right of access, military access, freedom of movement, but also the right of denial, the right to deny a military competitor access to the land, air, and sea surrounding those 3 countries. For those of you who know your strategic history, you know how vital those 3 countries were to U.S. access to the Western Pacific and East Asia over the course of the 20th century. The agreements that were structured in the 1970s and 1980s, the compacts, allowed the United States to continue to have unrestricted access from Hawaii and the West Coast to the Western Pacific, to East Asia, for a variety of contingencies, not least of which is Taiwan. If the United States loses the ability to project military power unobstructed across the Central Pacific to East Asia, the entire balance, the military balance in the Indo-Pacific, will be altered in extraordinarily damaging ways that undermine both U.S. security, Japanese security, and the stability of the entire region. I think as we look at the potential for the next American administration, and we look at how critical it is to have a free and open Indo-Pacific, and how this, as I mentioned, the Indo-Pacific Strategic Framework served as a guiding principle of President Trump's foreign policy. President Biden continued largely that approach through his national security strategy and his own series of strategic documents. If we look at an underappreciated aspect of the kind of cohesive piece drawing together the Indo-Pacific, free and open Indo-Pacific concept that Prime Minister Abe did so much to help coin, it is this idea of the second and third island chains being absolutely essential to U.S. power projection and the ability of the United States to prevent an adversary from projecting power into the Pacific. So I would look forward to taking your questions, but I would simply say, as we think about issues and challenges that face the alliance, issues and challenges that we'll have to confront collectively as the United States, Japan, and our like-minded partners, I would simply say that a focus on the Taiwan Strait, a focus on the Korean Peninsula, a focus on the South and East China Seas, important, critical, but it misses one of the most imperative aspects of a comprehensive Indo-Pacific strategy, and that is ensuring unobstructed access to the second island chain and beyond. China is currently waging an aggressive coercive effort to prevent that access, and I think it is imperative that all of us who care about a free and open Indo-Pacific understand that we must understand the challenge we face, the scale and the magnitude of the Chinese challenge in that region, and are prepared to resource our response accordingly. Thank you very much for hosting me, and I'm looking forward to taking your questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Just from myself, I'd like to quickly ask one question. You mentioned at the beginning of your speech that that ties between Japan and the U.S. reached the apex during the Trump administration. I was wondering, how far was that actually due to the personal relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Abe, and can that kind of relationship be reproduced with a different Japanese leader? And if so, who could that be?
Well, I think that the strength of the U.S.-Japan relationship certainly was helped dramatically by the personal rapport that Prime Minister Abe and President Trump had. I was privileged to be in Trump Tower when Prime Minister Abe came to congratulate the president-elect in 2016 on his victory. And I think that act, which was incredibly gracious and showed respect not just to President Trump, but it showed great respect to the will of the American people in electing President Trump, that paved the way for a relationship of trust that did much to facilitate the policy successes that the U.S. and Japan had under their collective leadership. I think in addition to the personal rapport, though, President Trump has always had a very sophisticated understanding of the role a free and open Indo-Pacific has in U.S. power. And as a business person, he instinctively understood the role that free and open trade has for American economic success, and the role that unobstructed access to the waterways and the sea lanes of the Indo-Pacific has for the U.S. economy. As someone who did not have a national security or foreign policy background, President Trump came into office, I think, with a very sophisticated business person's understanding of the importance of the Indo-Pacific. And through his relationship with Prime Minister Abe, I think he began to appreciate the strategic importance of the Japanese alliance, and that only grew over the course of his presidency. And so I think it was a mix of personal and strategic considerations that helped us achieve the successes that we did in the alliance.
Okay, thank you. Let's throw questions open to the floor then. Please remember to give your name before you give your question.
My name is Nishimura. freelance. Thank you very much for today. Let me ask two questions. One is since Russia invaded Ukraine 2 years ago, there are some kind of development in Asia-Pacific region. One is summit talking between Japan and China last fall, and they talked about mainly the economic issues. And I think there are some kind of soft mood between two countries. So. And Kishida is willing to visit Pyongyang, and North Korea send a message that there'll possibly be a visit of Pyongyang in the future. So those events, do you think is preferable for United States? This is one question. And another is one of the important security issue between Japan and United States is Okinawa. There is both governments promoting building the new base in Hinoko, but the soil around Hinoko is reported to be as soft as mayonnaise. So do you think the Trump 2.0 is going to continue that plan, or do you think they have another alternatives? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for your questions. On the first one, I think from a U.S. strategic interest standpoint, what the most important consideration for the U.S. in the Indo-Pacific is the hub and spoke alliance system, and maintaining with the U.S.-Japan alliance really at the center of that hub and spoke system, and the other partnerships, the other multilateral relationships as corollaries to it. Japan is going to make its own considerations on economic matters. I think everyone understands Japan's proximity to China. The United States has tremendous economic interdependence with China. I think everyone understands the difficulty, as highlighted by the COVID pandemic, of decoupling or strategically reassessing the economic ties between China and the U.S., Japan, or the European countries for that matter. I think what's most important from a U.S. strategic perspective is that the U.S. and Japan are cooperating and coordinating our approach economically to the Chinese challenge. I was privileged when I was in government to be involved in some of the economic security dialogues that grew under President Trump and Prime Minister Abe's leadership. We all understand that there are going to be discussions on trade and economic access that go on, but alongside those are going to also need to be U.S.-Japan discussions about how do we harden our economies collectively against Chinese coercion. No one has to tell Japan about the threat of Chinese economic coercion. You've felt it, you've seen it in many ways. What I think is most important from a U.S. perspective is that aspect of the relationship grows and enhances alongside whatever conversations Japan chooses to have with Beijing. On your question on Okinawa, the United States obviously has a long-standing complicated history in Okinawa. I obviously do not speak for President Trump or his campaign. He's going to have a very, as we have throughout the Futema relocation process, President Trump is going to have a very sophisticated analysis done by his Defense Department leadership of where that process stands. Would obviously never want to prejudge that. I do think from a strategic standpoint, the key question for the United States is going to be, what is the best, working with our Japanese partners, what's the best disposition of U.S. and self-defense forces assets to maintain the security of the U.S., Japan, and the broader region? And how we go about doing that, obviously on an operational level, is something I would want to leave to the military experts. But I think the key strategic question has to be, what is that correct allocation of forces to respond to whatever the contingency might be in the Indo-Pacific? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next.
Okay, thank you. I'm a Korean journalist Sang-hoon Lee from 동아일보. Let's talk about the Korean Peninsula. Two questions. First, experts said that North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is trying to win recognition as a nuclear power through the U.S.-North Korea summit after Trump is elected. What does Mr. Trump have in mind about North Korea now? Also, what is his view on the semiconductor supply chain in South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan regarding the recent global re-establishment of semiconductor supply chains? Thank you.
Thank you. The unique part about the 2024 election is we don't necessarily have to speculate like we usually do with a challenger to the U.S. presidency. We don't have to speculate as much about what President Trump might do if he were elected because we have 4 years of evidence to fall back on. When President Trump was in the White House from 2017 to 2021, he was unafraid to try different strategies that previous presidents had been reluctant to undertake. I think the most notable example of that was using economic and military pressure to bring Kim Jong-un to the negotiating table and to be creative about the diplomacy that we used to try and get a better and different outcome than the U.S. and our partners had gotten on the Korean Peninsula for 30 years. Now, obviously, those negotiations didn't produce the result that we had hoped for and that our partners had hoped for. But I think what it showed is that President Trump, one, is not bound by conventional diplomacy. He has no problem breaking outside the mold of kind of the Washington think tank consensus. Just because something's been done before doesn't mean it has to be done again or can't be done. And I think it showed that President Trump intuitively understands the only way to have successful negotiations is through strength, to come from a position of strength and to have leverage when you enter into a negotiation, particularly with an adversary like North Korea. The president has been very clear in his public comments. If you look back at things he said going back to his time, last 3 years since he left office, he's been very clear that he felt that the negotiations with North Korea, unfortunately, met an end he was not hoping for, but he has never expressed any sense that they're hopeless or that the stalemate on the peninsula is a permanent situation. I think one lesson from President Trump's leadership has been he is willing to consistently try new techniques on problems, whether it's the Abraham Accords in the Middle East, whether it's Serbia-Kosovo, whether it's the Korean Peninsula. He's willing to consistently try new techniques and approaches to very old, very difficult problems. So I think he's been very clear about his willingness to not give up on a problem because it's complicated. The second issue is semiconductors. As I've been one of the Republicans in Washington who's been most vocal about the importance of the CHIPS Act and the importance of the United States having an indigenous semiconductor capacity for economic and national security purposes. President Trump, when he was in office, laid the predicate for much of that work. President Trump and his Department of Commerce, his National Economic Council, began leading the way for building what later became the CHIPS Act. And we were very vocal and open about wanting to use the power of the U.S. government to help build an indigenous semiconductor industry. And that, I should note, does not mean excluding companies outside the United States. It obviously means promoting semiconductor manufacturing in the United States, whether that's Intel, whether that's Samsung, whether it's any number of other companies. That just means that we have to have fabrication facilities domestically for our own security, economic and national security. President Trump's been very clear about that. I think that one of the concerns that I have expressed and that others on the right side of the political spectrum in the United States have expressed is that the way the Biden administration is administering the CHIPS Act has failed to have the success that we hoped it would have for a variety of domestic political reasons. And my hope is that should President Trump return to the White House, we'll have a very different approach to administering the CHIPS Act in a way that enhances our national security. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next, the gentleman there in the middle.
Daniel Manning, Japan Forward. Thank you for your opening remarks. This is a little bit related to Ms. Reynolds' question. Recently, former Prime Minister and close confidant of the late Mr. Abe, Taro Aso, attempted to organize a meeting with Mr. Trump that failed to come to fruition. In your opinion, how should Japan interpret this? Thank you.
I would interpret it very simply. The president's running a nationwide election campaign, and he's dealing with a variety of other issues, and his focus is on becoming the Republican nominee and being elected president of the United States. We have one president at a time, and President Trump is very careful that he's not going to cross into President Biden's responsibilities while he's president. If I were Japanese policymakers and media, I would simply interpret it as a person who's not yet in public office, who's focused on his campaign to resume public office, and it does not, in my view, I don't think it reflects anything about President Trump's views except he has a job to do right now.
Okay, thank you. Next, the lady in the front.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth from the Japan Times. US allies increasingly share the view that national and economic security are linked. I'm curious to get a sense of how you maintain diplomatic buy-in and strong relations with allies when there's discussion at the moment of blanket economic policy by Mr. Trump. I'm thinking in particular of that 10% universal import on tariffs.
Right. Well, I should also add, the president was also clear he wanted 60% tariffs on the PRC. And the president, I think, has been unambiguous in his concern that China has particularly been a malign economic actor, not just hurting U.S. jobs and U.S. productivity, but the defense industrial base. That the attack, I would argue, by the Chinese state-owned enterprises, by China's 5-year plans, by their Made in China 2025 initiative, is targeted at the economic and defense industrial base of the United States. And so President Trump, when he was in office, did a number of defensive measures to try and prevent that malign activity. President Trump, again, I think, based on his public statements, if he returned to office, I have no doubt President Trump would reapproach that same toolkit, to make sure that the U.S. was hardened economically against China's economic predations. Now, to your question about how do we have diplomatic outreach, how do we have a diplomatic approach to the issue, this is not unique to the United States. China has economically targeted Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Taiwan, Norway, Lithuania. You go down the list of places that have been subject to China's economic coercion and the malign influence. It's extraordinary. And so I think it is not difficult, and President Trump did this in his first term, it will not be difficult to make a compelling argument to our friends and partners around the world that this needs to be a multi-front, multifaceted, multilateral approach to hardening ourselves collectively against Beijing. We saw this with Japan in critical minerals going back almost 15 years. And this is an area where still critical minerals, the United States and our partners have considerable vulnerability and dependency on China. We saw it in the COVID-19 pandemic, where China openly threatened Australia, openly threatened other U.S. partners and allies, that if their policy preferences weren't realized, they would retaliate by cutting off pharmaceutical supplies. I think we have all seen the vulnerability the West collectively has, the countries that believe in the liberal world order. I think we've all seen how vulnerable we are. And I don't think it's a difficult step to have enhanced coordination and cooperation as the collective liberal democracies to withstand what China is doing, which is it's economic warfare, and we have to be realistic about that. And the only way, in my view, to be successful over the long term is to have coordination among ourselves to harden ourselves against that threat.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you for your time. My name is Kawano Koda from Asahi, a Japanese media outlet. And I have one question related to the previous question about North Korea. Recently, Prime Minister Kishida began to say that he's going to be ready to meet up with Kim Jong-un without any conditions. But as I remember, there has been some testimonies that when Mr. Trump had the talks with the North Korean leader in several times in the past, he has often mentioned about the settlement of a possible settlement of North Korean abductee issues, which still certain amount of Japanese people are expected to stay in the domestic of North Korea. So do you expect that if Mr. Trump is back to the office and has a chance to talk with Kim Jong-un, he might mention about the possible solutions of Japanese abductee issues of North Korea, or do you think he's not going to mention about that? Thank you. It's my question.
Thank you. Well, again, I would never presume to speak for the president, but what I would say is Prime Minister Abe was a tremendous advocate for the abductees, and under his leadership, that was something that was communicated to the U.S. government at nearly every level, at every step of our discussions and negotiations with the Kim regime. The Prime Minister Abe's government, I think, was very clear in all of our discussions that needed to be a priority. It was a priority to them, it's a priority to the Japanese people, and that they viewed that as part of our alliance dialogue. They viewed that as critical for us to be championing it as well. Again, I would never speak for the president in the conversations he had privately with another world leader, but I would just say that every level of the U.S. government appreciated and was aware of how sensitive the issue was in Japan and how much of a priority Prime Minister Abe and his team attached to it. Thank you.
Okay. Okay.
Good morning. Rocky Swift with Reuters. Just a moment ago, you described Mr. Trump as a business person who instinctively understood the role that free and open trade has for American economic success. And you also just spoke about the importance of alliances for critical materials like chips and pharmaceuticals. So how does that jibe with Mr. Trump's recent claim that he would block Nippon Steel's takeover of U.S. Steel? Isn't that just a business relationship between companies in two allied countries?
Well, I think that the president, when we talk about what the president, at the big picture level, the president has always had, as I said, a very, I think, acute understanding of the strategic importance of a Indo-Pacific that is unobstructed, that allows free passage of goods and services, and allows free access from a military standpoint for the U.S. to be able to project power. I think that's totally consistent with having concerns on an individual level with specific transactions. The Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, is going to make a determination about Nippon Steel. They're going to have and U.S. Steel. That's an ongoing process. President Trump, like President Biden, like other politicians in the United States, they're going to weigh in on these issues because it's a domestic issue of concern. What I will say, though, I don't think that's at all contradictory with President Trump's general view that we have to have, and it's not just his view, it's the actions that he took for 4 years as president, his approach to alliances and his approach to keeping the Indo-Pacific free and open, I don't think a view on an individual business transaction changes that general dynamic.
Thank you. Anybody else? More questions? We have one from online. This is from Jesse Johnson from the Japan Times. This is somewhat related to my first question, but the first one is, with the death of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, Japan lacks a so-called Trump whisperer who is close to the ex-president. So far, Japan has sent former Prime Minister Taro Aso to meet Trump and others close to him. Reports said Aso was able to speak with some in Mr. Trump's inner circle. I'm wondering if Japanese officials have approached you or the former president in recent months.
Well, look, the president has, this is a very different effort than 2016. President Trump has a cadre of people around him, informal, who have exceptional government service, people who, like former National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, former Secretary of Defense Chris Miller, General Keith Kellogg, the list goes on. And these are all people with long experience in Japan who have relationships at various levels in Japanese government and society. The president has his own, after 4 years of dealing with Japan on a constant basis, the president has his own views and approaches to how Japan fits into the Indo-Pacific framework that he signed out and that he implemented. So I don't think there needs to be a Trump whisperer the way I've continually heard discussion here in Japan. The president had a very unique personal relationship with Prime Minister Abe. Prime Minister Abe, I think at the time that he flew to Trump Tower after the 2016 election, that was an important moment in time, and it was an important effort that the Prime Minister made to build a bridge to the new administration, an administration that didn't have the continuity of previous Republican administrations. It was a different group of personnel. It was a different leader who didn't have a long record in foreign policy. That's not the case anymore. President Trump has a record of extraordinary friendship with Japan and tangible accomplishments in alliance management and alliance building. And he has a team around him of advisors and confidants who have a record going back, in some cases, many, many years of friendship and collaboration with Japan. So it's a very different situation. And I guess my general view is there doesn't need to be some sort of special whisperer when you can just look back at what President Trump did and have a sense of what he's likely to do in the future.
Okay, I mean, just the last part of that question, have Japanese officials approached you or the former president in recent months?
Well, I can't speak to the former president, but I've worked with Japanese officials for over a decade now, and I've had conversations with former officials. I've had conversations with folks in academia and think tanks. I think the Japanese government is very careful, as they should be, to focus on we have one government, we have one president at a time, and the Japanese government is dealing with President Biden and his team as they should. And if there is a change in administration, I know that they'll appropriately reach out. But I think everyone's focused on one president at a time.
Okay, thank you. He has a second question here, actually, very short one. Are you hoping to secure a position in another Trump administration if he's reelected?
Look, it was the greatest professional honor I've ever had to work in the White House. As a kid from Oklahoma, I never thought I'd be in the West Wing of the White House. It was a great honor. It's one of those things, if the President of the United States wants you to have a role, it's hard to say no.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, any more questions? Yes, Rocky.
Thank you. Rocky Swift again with Reuters. You say that Mr. Trump would reassert a policy to protect Taiwan and its allies in the Asia-Pacific, but in his most recent actions on this, he helped kill a bill in Congress that would have extended military aid to Taiwan. And further, I mean, he's also multiple times said that he would not uphold NATO defense commitments to other NATO allies. So given these most recent words and deeds, why should Japan, Taiwan, and other allies in the Asia-Pacific have any faith that he'd uphold these co-defense agreements?
I think that our allies should have confidence based on his actual record. You know, if you look at how President Trump governed, he had more foreign military sales to Taiwan up until that time than any four-year administration. You look at the way we changed the U.S. approach to Taiwan from a engagement standpoint, the highest level visitors at the highest continual tempo of any administration in history. We changed the Taiwan contact guidelines to give Taiwan more of diplomatic space and a diplomatic presence in Washington. For years, they had been handcuffed and kept from having the type of normal diplomatic interchanges that others have. And President Trump and Secretary Pompeo and Ambassador O'Brien got rid of those guidelines and I would say, normalized the way we do business with Taiwan. You can go down the list of accomplishments from that very first phone call the president-elect had with Tsai Ing-wen. It was an incredibly fruitful relationship. And I would say, just like the Japan alliance, when President Trump left office, the U.S.-Taiwan relationship was at its apex. And that's across all measures of what I would consider a successful relationship. Same with NATO. You know, I know there's a lot of focus on the rhetoric, but when you look at the actions that we took when the president was in office, President Trump, we've talked about this since Jimmy Carter, but President Trump actually got NATO to contribute to its defense in a way that it had not done for decades. President Trump provided the Javelin anti-tank missiles to Ukraine that the Ukrainians are using so effectively today. President Trump President Trump cracked down on the Nord Stream pipeline. President Trump sanctioned more Russians than any president in American history. President Trump did more to establish deterrence against Russia in ways that actually strengthen NATO tangibly, not just with words, than any president in living memory. So I think we have to, again, this is a unique election. This is an election where we can actually look at how he governed, not just campaign slogans and not just the American media's coverage of him. We can actually look at what he did.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Right, perhaps we'll go back to, if you don't mind, could we go back again to the US-Japan relationship? And you talked extensively about how, you know, that relationship between Prime Minister Abe and President Trump was very close and very important. But looking at what Japan actually gained from that, I mean, Japan was still subjected to steel tariffs. It was still asked to pay more for the presence of US troops in Japan. Can you point to sort of a concrete gain that Japan made from having this relationship?
I think the concrete gain is an alliance system that was able to effectively, whether it's the Quad, whether it's all the enhanced alliance dialogues, whether it's the president operationalizing his relationship with Prime Minister Abe in tangible ways to increase deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. Look, you know, when President Trump took office, we had an Indo-Pacific that was extraordinarily destabilized by South China Sea, East China Sea. We had seen 4 years, really, of China ascendant and on the march. What we had seen the previous administration talking about a new model of great power relations. We had seen almost an acquiescence to China as a rival power center to the United States. We had seen destabilization from North Korea shooting missiles on a regular basis. We had seen over and over again economic coercion by the Chinese toward Japan and towards others. President Trump had such extraordinary, not just at the personal level with Prime Minister Abe, but across the administration, the level of coordination led to us actually being able to reestablish deterrence in the region, to keep China at bay, frankly, from compared to the 2013-2017 timeframe. We were able to actually have a stable, prosperous Indo-Pacific. And then the other thing I would point out, President Trump implemented a framework, the Free and Open Indo-Pacific framework, that took for granted something that had been, from 2013 to 2017, I think really had been lost. And this also goes back to our national security strategy in 2017. President Trump changed the entire approach of the United States government to China. In my view, this is going to be his greatest legacy. President Trump went from, the famous speech by former National Security Advisor Susan Rice about a new model of great power relations. We went from that to stating unequivocally in our national security strategy that China was the pacing threat. China was a peer competitor, and the United States government had to prepare at every level to address it. Prime Minister Abe understood this for years. Prime Minister Abe had been working within your own system, within Japan's system, to prepare for that eventuality. But he didn't have a partner in Washington who understood that same reality. President Trump, through his national security strategy, through his countering China's economic aggression strategy, through his Indo-Pacific strategic framework, through his national defense strategy, through his national military strategy, every one of the key documents that govern how the U.S. government approaches the world around it changed under his leadership to treat China as the paramount threat. To me, I don't know that Prime Minister Abe and the government of Japan could have had a more successful outcome if your goal is to bring the United States around to the reality that the Prime Minister saw long before most leaders. I don't know that there could have been a more successful outcome than that.
Okay, thank you. Anyone have some follow-up questions on that? I was just curious about you mentioned a couple of times the difference between the rhetoric and the actual things that the Trump administration did. So I guess to me, one of the main benefits that Japan gained from having this relationship between Mr. Abe and Mr. Trump was that they were not subject to the kind of rhetoric that perhaps South Korea and other allies were subject to. Do you think that sort of played into that President Trump felt he had such a relationship with Abe that he didn't need to sort of publicly make these stands to affect a change in policy?
Well, look, I think President Trump President Trump was able, I think, to resolve a lot of issues with Prime Minister Abe directly because of the personal relationship. And also, senior folks in his administration had great relationships with their counterparts in the government of Japan. And, unfortunately, President Trump's first term, we had a government in South Korea that had a very different approach to foreign policy and to the world around it. And that admittedly made it difficult to have the type of coordination and collaboration that we have with Japan. We at the time had we had a government in there. We were very fortunate to have a government and Prime Minister Abe where there was both the personal relationship at the top level, at the leader level, also throughout the chain, but also to have a similar worldview. And that certainly made a difference in allowing us to resolve a lot of issues at that even before it got to the leader level, able to resolve a lot of issues at the working level in a way that I think was particularly constructive.
Okay, thank you very much. Any last questions? I think we're almost there. Oh, yes, I have one in the front.
Nishimura again, free journalist. There is actually the presidential election this fall, but before that, the Prime Minister Kishida is going to visit Washington next month or next month. So, what do you expect in terms of security between Japan and the United States in that talk or some speech in Congress by Kishida? What do you expect?
Well, I expect that the government of Japan is going to continue making similar points to what have been made for the last several years. I think the government of Japan broadly has had a consistent policy approach to what it wants out of the U.S. alliance, what it wants from an Indo-Pacific stability standpoint. And I think one of the things that I have heard from folks in Japan who I talk to is there's a great desire to have an engaged U.S. presence, doesn't matter who's in the White House. They want to have a United States that is maintaining stability and deterrence, whether it's in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, a U.S. that is living up to its alliance commitments, and a U.S. that is engaged in all the different multilateral mechanisms that we have, whether it's the new trilateral cooperation agreement, whether it's the Quad, whatever the mechanism may be. And I think that message is going to be conveyed to President Biden and his team. And I expect whoever the next president is in January 2025 is going to hear a similar message. So I think the continuity that we've seen in the messages coming out of Tokyo over the last several years have been very helpful in terms of setting expectations in the United States for how the alliance needs to operate.
Okay, gentleman at the back.
Hi, my name is Takami Hanzo from Kyoto News. Thank you very much for today's presentation. It was fascinating. According to, correct me if I'm wrong, according to the memoir of former Secretary of Defense, Esper, he said that Mr. Trump was so unhappy with the trade imbalance between U.S. and South Korea, and he once tried to withdraw American forces from South Korea. Is that true? And how serious was he? And will it happen again at some point in his second term? Sorry, this is going to be a speculation, but was he serious about it?
Look, Secretary Esper had a very difficult tenure in the Trump administration. And Secretary Esper, unfortunately, was not aligned with the president's objectives. And I think it's been very unfortunate the way Secretary Esper has broken confidences and has chosen to air speculation and to air his personal grievances in a way that's not constructive for the U.S. role in the world, and really is beneath someone who's held the job of Secretary of Defense. So I would be very cautious in taking anything that's in Secretary Esper's book too seriously.
Okay, thank you. So although the previous question touched the allied countries' leaders can have a good confidence in Mr. Trump if he comes back.
Again, I would look at the actual policies that were implemented for 4 years, and what you saw was I've run through it, but I mean you've seen the strength of deterrence and the focus that was given to deterring Chinese aggression, and we saw a commitment to rebuilding the U.S. hard power deterrent in the region. I think that's something that's going to be a priority again, and I think that there's going to be, from an allied perspective, there will always be areas of disagreement. The president was always concerned with some of our free trade agreements, many of which were legacies of a different era, where the United States had different expectations about what could come out of our bilateral trade agreements. As you can tell from President Biden's administration, the U.S. consensus domestically on free trade has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. President Trump and President Biden are reflecting American public opinion on that. So President Trump raising substantial concerns about bilateral economic issues with very strong strategic partners, I don't think, and this is reflected by his actions as president, I don't think raising those economic concerns means that the strategic relationships are going to be damaged or going to change substantially. And I hope that our great partners and allies understand that whoever's president is going to have to reflect American concerns about how is free trade and our FTAs fair for American workers. And I think until our allies kind of internalize that domestic challenge that our leaders are facing, I think you will continue to be, you will continue to hear from Democratic and Republican leaders. You will continue to hear very real concerns about economic relationships.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Any final questions? We just have about 3 minutes left. If not, let's leave it at that. So, Alex Gray, thank you so much for your thoughts. And as is our tradition, we'd like to present you with an honorary one-year membership to the club.
Thank you so much.
Anytime you'd like to come and join us for a drink, you'd be very welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.